All right, Ariana, we've got the second year of our personal statement workshop coming up. It's a part of this sort of project that we've conceived sort of, kind of broadly as a storytelling lab that we
Yeah.
imagine having a broad future. But as we enter into this second year, what would you say to our audience about storytelling and the myths of good writing and storytelling that you want to dispel? What are
Yeah.
those?
Yeah. So I'll, start with, I think a big one that will really clear a lot of the hurdles that comes with writing a personal statement for such a big application when you're, 18, 19, 21, 22, is that, you don't have to be the main character in your story.
Mhm.
And it comes from, a couple of things. One, you're young, you haven't necessarily lived a whole life's worth of stories. Maybe you have, some people have, but if you haven't, it pulls you away from scraping the barrel of your life to try to figure out something that might be profound or interesting to read. If you look at the people around you, the people who made you, and that doesn't necessarily mean in your direct vicinity, although it's true, it could be, your great grandmother and her rituals, what your granddad did, some photographs that he took in my case, right? But it
Mhm.
could also be the thinkers that led to your interest in something. I always go back to this because it's such an amazing example. Um, I am blanking on this student's name that will come to me, but
Mhm.
she talks about how somebody framed Ida B. Wells to her as a data scientist. And I
Mhm.
thought that that was such an interesting framework, right? So in that one, she writes about, Ida B. Wells tells a bit about her life. So clearly she's the main character. But in
Mhm.
framing her as a data scientist, this was Princess. In framing her as a data scientist, Princess was able to bring that part of the story into her interest and understand that, hey, her story, her life journey, the parts where she was the main character has influenced the start of mine. And I think that that's really, really huge, just the world of story that you're trying to build. And that's a big part of an essay, right? You have a world of stories. You have yourself, you have whoever was influencing you, you have the writings, the readings, the thoughts. It doesn't just have to exist inside your head and your imagination.
Yeah.
It can really, you can really get into the head and the imagination of others. Like, what if Ida B. Wells did imagine herself as a data scientist?
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the things that I'm hoping to maybe move students toward thinking about.
Yeah, right. Because the Princeton data science lab that Ruha Benjamin created, it takes Ida B. Wells as a data scientist.
Yeah.
I would say I would, as the person who sort of conceived of this the storytelling lab for the sake of these personal narratives. The thing that I would like to dispel is this idea that storytelling is a talent exclusively, that you have to be born with the ability to do it.
Mhm.
I think you have to be interested in it, right? You have to want to tell the story because you understand that the
Yeah.
story is the conveyor of the insight of the wisdom.
Yeah.
So it's what Toni Morrison says about the importance of the novel, right? And the stories that we write, since people don't tell
Mhm.
stories anymore, the writing has to convey, the novel has to convey the insight. So,
Exactly.
yeah, I want to dispel this myth that you're born with this sort of ability to tell a story, but also the idea that the story is just sort of a string of eloquent words. I
Yeah.
think those two things
Exactly.
go together. But there
Exactly.
is a point, right? There's a
Mhm.
reason why you're telling this.
Yeah.
And I think students often sort of take it for granted because they imagine that a reader is someone who just what do they think that
When someone is just, going through skimming these, personal statements and thinking, oh, well, that's nice. You wrote about, your grandma, you wrote about your small town. Okay, great. Here you go. And they are looking for depth. They are looking for story. They're not just
yeah,
looking for, like you said, a string of pretty words or, a string of unconnected images. They're looking for,
yeah, Yeah,
Yeah,
like, somehow I'm going to put these words on this page and the reader is going to appreciate them. No,
yeah,
that's a part of what your craft will do in
exactly,
combination
exactly.
with the reader, right?
I love
So,
that. And traditionally, of
mhm,
course, we're, African descendants, so we come from a people who valued griots.
yeah.
Griots were not born. A baby didn't get born and they stamped a thumb on its head and said, this one is a storyteller. Griots were trained, right? They had to study under the previous storytellers and they had to be observers. The
Yeah,
one thing that you have to do as a griot is understand that looking is not just, something that your eyes do when you wander around the room. It's an intentional practice. And
yeah,
it's an understanding that you collect memories like you would collect shells on the beach.
yeah.
They're all different. They're all really, really beautiful. And they all have, a kind of different claws. And if you arrange them, it
Mhm.
becomes something, right? And so, yeah,
Yes.
I think that that's, that's a big part of it too.
Yeah, and I like that verb. I mean, those verbs, right? The arranging, the paying attention, that there's craft, right? So this again, like the notion that that a storyteller, it just springs from the imagination of it as if it's easy. But it's work.
Yeah.
It's work that you can take a great deal of pleasure from, derive a great deal of pleasure from, but it's a lot of work. So understanding that, right, that creativity is sort of given and that its fruits just
Mhm.
bear themselves out as opposed to sort of being worked on,
Yeah. And
tilled
on
and
that idea
grafted.
of, you being able to take pleasure in it, I think that's another point that I kind of want to emphasize is that,
Mhm.
the personal statement, essay, whatever, it doesn't just have to be another box to tick. I
Yeah,
have to do this to apply to something. It will be if you're writing it and you're just trying to squeeze something out that you don't really want to talk about, but you have to answer this question, meet this requirement, whatever.
yeah,
But if you're telling a story that's really important to you, something that you've always answering a question that's always been in the back of your mind, it can be a really pleasurable experience. And I know the students that I talked to last year, several of them had success, some of them didn't, but regardless, across the board, the one thing that I heard them say was that I really, really enjoyed taking this class because it made me think about stories that I had always just kind of put to the side because I
yeah,
couldn't figure out how to make it fit into a school assignment or something, an application, so I didn't have time for it. Well, this is your chance. What
yeah,
is the story that you've always been thinking about that's important to nobody but you, because then nobody but you can make it important to everybody else.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's where the joy in that storytelling comes from.
Yeah, that's lovely. That right, like that. Another way of thinking about the requirement to do it is that you can reframe that and it becomes an opportunity to make sense of these collections of thoughts that you've had and didn't have an outlet for them. So to that point, I've got another question here. What common storytelling mistakes do you see student writers making?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit, but forgetting that somebody will reading your work, and at that point, neglecting the audience. So I think they,
Right.
kind of imagine these panels as just people who are really going through and checking to make sure they've done all the parts of the application, and that
Hmm.
the personal statement is kind of just a box to tick. It's something that is not, as important as maybe a resume, a GPA, another writing sample, right? That's not
Yeah.
necessarily again, it is especially,
Hmm.
in my experience, I was directly told after my Marshall Scholar interview, and I had already gotten it, hey, your resume, all of this, credentials didn't necessarily stack up to everybody else's, which I knew because I was competing with people who had, worked on rovers that had gone to the moon and worked on
Right.
HBO shows. Yeah. So it was never going to stack up, which I knew. But she said, we chose you before we even met you because we thought your personal statement was that meaningful and that
Yeah.
impactful.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I think people don't understand. They pour over these statements. They
Yeah.
want to get to know who they're choosing because when you're putting together a program, it's not just, saying, well, these are objectively the top 10 students, we're slicing off the stack. It's you're putting a group of people together to create knowledge, to develop community, right? To
Yeah.
do the work that is intended by the program. So they're not just looking for, oh, how do we find the best? We're looking for how do we find the people that have the stories, the passion, the ideas to do what we think this organization is intended to do. And so that,
That's
we're going
right.
to read your statement.
That's
Really do.
right. Yeah, I do think that that's so true. I mean, that students discount the meaningfulness of the audience so much. And to their detriment, they presume that the reader wants to read their story, right?
Yeah,
As
that we're just,
opposed to, yeah,
no,
like that's
you got to
generally
make
not
this.
what's happening, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that in doing so, they don't recognize that the story is, it reveals good thinking
Mhm.
and consideration for this person, right? Like imagining what people need in order to be invested in you, in order for the details to make sense. That
Mhm.
is quality of mind. So the story as a reflection of who you are, as opposed to sort of just kind of thinking of it, to your point, as just an element
Yeah.
in a long series of things, is definitely a common mistake that they
Yeah,
make.
absolutely. I mean, if you think about, and again, I'm like relaying to, hopefully images that the students will understand, but if you think about how, your grandmother would arrange objects on her mantle, my grandmothers both have, tons of little curios and statues and
Hmm.
everything. They're not all the same size. They don't just look all the same. And that, I'm hoping to kind of convey that with um, this idea of an application. So some elements of your application are going to be stronger than others, right? Maybe your personal statement is stronger than your resume. Maybe it's the other way around. But the personal statement should still always be the centerpiece,
Yeah,
regardless. That should be, the focal point. Because if there's nothing else around it, the mantle will look empty. But if
yeah,
everything else is trying to dominate, it's going to be what? Talky, it's going to be not, focusing on the beautiful part, which is you. They're accepting
yeah,
you, a person. They're not accepting a bunch of papers. So if you
yeah.
think about it as you're arranging, objects on a mantle, books on a shelf, then you really want to make sure that that part is your centerpiece and that one stands out.
Yeah, that's a lovely image. I mean, even when I'm not a storyteller in a classical sense, but I'm very much a narrative writer. And a part of even like letters of recommendation that I write are informed by my sort of desire to connect with the reader. And so I'm trying to bring in personality. I'm recognizing that this person may have to read hundreds of these. And so I want them to land on something that is engaging, that gives, to quote the
Yeah.
students. Right. And so, right. Like, I've talked to colleagues about this. Sometimes they will email you and say, look, don't tell the student because this is a long process, but I really enjoy reading your letter
Yeah.
because I get a sense for who you are, who the student is, what your relationship is with this person. And
Mhm.
so, right, like it has color. I mean,
Mhm.
there's personality in what you've written, but it's personality for a point, right?
Yeah.
Not
And
just
I
for
think
the sake of telling it.
exactly. And I think, the letter of recommendation comparison works so perfectly because that's really what a personal statement is. It's a letter of recommendation for yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And if there was no, if letter of recommendations weren't different than resumes or, transcripts, nobody would ask for them. But
Right.
they do serve that different purpose to, like you said, kind of fill in those more interesting things, those really give context to who a student is. I know that that's something that you really do well in the letters that you've written for me, is kind of give context to the
Yeah.
significance of the student's work rather than just touting it and praising it, building a world around it so that you
Yeah.
see it as it is in its intended space and you can understand its significance better.
That's it. And I think too, I mean, to that point, I think that in what you were saying about, look, I didn't land a rover on Mars. I can't say that I worked on that project.
Yeah.
But what we also know is that there are people who are in these, like really elite, programs, and they've worked with these Nobel Prize winning scientists. But what you can't say, what you cannot say is that just because you were in that program, that you're thoughtful,
Yeah.
So there's a difference between having completed it and having been thoroughly engaged
Mhm.
and capable, right? I mean, and so a part of what you're trying to indicate
Mhm.
is your quality of mind. And what we know is that you can't manufacture those, right?
Oh,
Like, so, MIT just can't churn that out.
yeah.
So it's important to recognize that you can compete through how you highlight what you're capable of doing through what you put on the page.
Absolutely. And then, to go back to the first point, I was certainly not the main character in, my essay. That was mostly about my grandfather, who is, first
Mhm,
African American Navy photographer. It was also about, these various poets that had inspired me in ways that kind of touched on screenwriting too. It was,
mhm.
Audre Lorde, and her idea that poetry is not a luxury. So it was all of these kind of characters that were creating a chorus, and they were singing the song that I wanted them to sing.
Yeah.
That is how you craft a personal statement that might not be all about you, but they're doing what you want them to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that is what I understood that. I mean, like early on, like for you, my grandfather was too. I mean,
Mhm.
he's still like the model of who I wanted to be as an intellectual, and he didn't go to college. I'm the first in my family to have gone to college, but the way his mind worked was always very evocative for
Mhm.
me to meditate on. But what I understood that students often like take for granted is that the people who are reading are people who value citations. So
Yes.
they're interested in like your grandfather as a source, but also how you put your grandfather in conversation with Audre Lorde.
Mhm.
Or like for me, sometimes it would be with Socrates, because I wound up being a philosophy major.
Mhm.
And so I would sort of put him in conversation, this sort of everyday Black wisdom as philosophical, like they were a part of the same tradition for me.
Right.
So, like, understanding that literate people want literacy,
Yeah. And
we
that
want
and
evidence of
that
that.
especially too points to something that they also really like, which is interdisciplinarity, right?
Yeah,
Because you're not saying necessarily that your granddad was literally in the same discipline, scholarship as
right.
Socrates, but there is connection there.
Yeah,
And that the idea that you can make novel connections,
yeah,
that is what makes the people sitting on a panel go, oh, dang, let's put this one to the good pile. Let's read it again.
yeah,
Because you're really, again, you're showing that interiority. You're showing that, like you
yeah,
said, that quality of mind.
yeah.
And it also encourages, this idea that you're not just doing a field because you think, oh, I want to study psychology. Oh, I want to study, STEM.
Hmm.
And so that's why I'm in it. But you're having a practical application to the rest of the world, right?
Yeah,
Because no matter what you study, science, art, et cetera, it doesn't exist inside a vacuum. So you
yeah,
have to be able to explain and show that you understand how this will affect a community, a thought group, broader than the ones that maybe you're working within right now.
yeah.
And that broader impact is also valuable.
That's absolutely right. Because, I mean, the ability to make a connection that isn't presumed, I mean, that is an act of creativity. And so, like, it shows like that you are a thinking person.
Mhm.
So I was telling a group of science students today that, it's generally like for students who are coming directly from high school, a surprise to know that science is interested in art,
Yeah.
right? And as I was explaining to them, it's the world building capacity,
Mhm.
so right, like if you're a scientist, you're interested in not necessarily what you see is what is to come, what you're innovating.
Exactly.
And so working with people who build entire worlds
Mhm.
is of interest.
Mhm.
And so how you put those things together is what people are interested in.
100%. How you put them together.
Yeah. Okay, so my other question is, what key insights do you want students to take away from your storytelling workshop?
Yeah, so I know a big, kind of point of contention discussion right now with personal statements and personal statement writing is, you know, the trauma essay, where you write about, you know, the most brutal things that has ever happened to you personally and systemically. You know, I see a lot of essays that come to me and it's just, you know, you're Black and you start talking about, you know, when I was a kid, the first time somebody called me a nigger.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine. If that experience really altered the course of your life, be prepared to argue that with me and we'll discuss that. But I want to get students thinking about writing from a place of interiority,
Yeah.
not externalism.
Yeah.
So there are things that happen to you. That's part of your story. Sure, you can tell that story, but I'm not going to let you tell something that happened to you without explaining what you learned from it, what
Yes.
changed about you because that happened.
Right.
What did you have to think about creatively to get over it? Because that's one of the things that really, you know, Black people are creative in many ways, but I don't think we necessarily talk about resilience as creativity, right?
Yeah.
You have to be real crafty to get up a whole bunch of different ways off of the ground when you keep being knocked down,
That's
right? There
it.
are lessons that you have to learn to change. Okay, I'm gonna pick up my left foot first. Okay, I'm gonna steady myself over here this time, you know? And so it's that resilience, that how you got up, that is the important part of the story. And that's the same to me with Blackness in general. I want us to be writing from a place not just about Blackness, which is, you know, kind of this concept that people see as something being enacted upon a group of people, but from a place of Blackness.
Yeah.
What are our traditions, our stories, our ideas, our loves that exist outside of whiteness, that exist just within us? What is
Yes.
within us as a people
Yeah.
that conjures Blackness before any of that other stuff comes in? So if you
Yeah.
want to talk about, you know, the external, I'm going to say that's fine, but you have to show me that interior. You have to show me where you're coming from,
Yeah.
what place of Blackness those thoughts are rooted in as well.
That is why I thought you were the perfect person to lead these workshops because you understood loving Blackness. And to that point, I had gotten so not just frustrated. It was I mean troubled
Yeah.
by the either ability or inability or like I don't, maybe it was maybe inability of Black students to recognize
Mm.
that there was another way of writing about their lives than from an antagonistic position with whiteness,
Yeah.
right? And so, right, like I thought, well, at an HBCU in particular, we know life beyond grievance. It
Mhm.
gets expressed through homecoming and fried chicken Wednesdays
Yeah.
and
Market Friday, all that.
Market Friday, all of that stuff
Mhm.
that is not about proving what this to white people.
Yeah, exactly.
And I sort of became interested in having a forum to teach Black students that, for one,
Mhm.
if you weren't aware of it, but I generally was. I was impressed with students who understood that our honors program was a place for them to tell different kinds of stories.
Yeah.
So when I got those stories, they were impressive, right?
Mhm.
It suggested something to me about what they thought about the audience, as well as how well they had reflected on their story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is like a trait of somebody, especially, you know, a Black person who has a really high quality of mind, high presence of mind that you wouldn't even understand, is that if you can understand that Blackness is not, you know, a cookie that was cut out from the dough of whiteness. It's
Yeah.
its own thing. And so that you can be able to talk about it in those ways, like those students were saying, in its kind of own way as its own thing. And I was just, you know, I understand the want to talk about, to shed light on all of the really frustrating parts of being Black, of racism. You know, I'm from what I would say is the Trayvon Martin generation, right?
Hmm.
That was my first big experience. I'll never forget. I think I was in like fourth grade, couldn't have been older than sixth grade. And I remember being so heartbroken and horrified. I didn't understand why George Zimmerman got, you know, didn't get convicted. Like I thought surely if the law was just, if that's how things were supposed to work, that would happen. But if I were to write about Trayvon Martin, and if we've, you know, talked about this, I've been thinking about it, it's not the poem that I would write that has anything to do with how he died. And I want us to kind of understand that too. You know, Black people who are killed, sometimes their lives just kind of get shrunk down and minimized to the way that they died. But, Trayvon Martin had dreams. He wanted to become a pilot. He had family, he had siblings. There was a neighborhood that he walked through every day that he knew probably like the back of his hand. There were all these things that happened before anything that had to do with external ideas of Blackness and, who he was that were not true came in. And so I want us to really understand that and to take Blackness as something that is alive, not Blackness that is something that is just waiting to be killed.
Yeah. And that's what I think is makes this a part of social justice work. Because if we're successful, then we will have Black students who are Black citizens who become people who know how to make this country miss these children that they've killed.
Yeah.
Right? Like if we've done this well,
Mhm.
then those children know how to create a world where you can literally mourn and grieve their loss.
Mhm.
And I think right now we've got work to do.
Yeah.
So I'm so happy to see that so many students have signed up.
Yeah.
And because, I mean, for both of us, I think it suggests that they see themselves as capable of telling new stories,
Mhm.
desirous of it, wanting to sort of connect with a richer sense of who they are, and be able to talk about it in meaningful ways.
Yeah, and that's really all I want, from students in this class. If I have something to say, if you've seen this and you signed up for the class, I would really, really just hope not that you come in with any kind of stress, expectation. I have to leave with a perfect statement. I have to, make sure that I'm doing everything exactly right. This isn't necessarily, a class for school where there are certain standards you have to meet and hoops that you
Hmm.
have to jump through. But what I do just hope for is that you're investing in the experience in the class, not just for me. I'm not really the one who's getting anything out of this, beyond the opportunity to teach, but really for you. And again, not just for the applications, but also for the story that is your life, for the story that is the people who built your life. I think of honestly people as amalgamations of the stories that made them. And so I'm
Hmm.
hoping that in helping students identify that, it might kind of repurpose what they understand is their place at Spelman, their place in the world, for the
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. And I mean, we've got students from all over the HBCU map. We've got some high school
Yeah,
kids.
there's
I
the
also think
Prince
that,
Morehouse.
yeah, I mean, I think that 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 their willingness to sort of sign up to, and from what we saw last time, is that what I also love is that it's another model of us as HBCUs in particular being in relation to each other in a way that isn't competitive. I get
Yeah.
tired of that.
Yeah, I
And
think I told you about, I was talking to somebody about, potentially working with them and doing another workshop. And she said, oh, that's great, but would it be a conflict of interest to, help students from other schools and this workshop is designed specifically for Black students. So it would be helping Black students regardless of the institution. And I thought that was the most ridiculous notion. The
I
conflict of
know.
interest, this knowledge is not being propagated for the sole purpose and betterment of Spelman College, right?
Mhm.
It's here for the students that I think need it. You wind up at Spelman College by many strokes of luck, honestly, and chance, and all of these things that don't really go into who you actually are. You wind up anywhere the same way. And so I wanted to broaden the scope of what we think is benefiting all of us,
Yeah.
in that way.
Yeah, same. I mean, like I was invited to make a recommendation for a prestigious fellowship that's sort of new. And one of my recipients, one of the people I offered the invitation to was not a Spelman student. It was a young Black man, and
Mhm.
he won. And what's interesting even about that is generally I tell students that I work with is I'm not even interested in whether or not they get the fellowship. I'm more interested in them having a good experience. And I want them to have a positive intellectual experience that has a different metric, right? Like, because in life, people don't give you A's and gold stars
Yeah.
for the work that you do. I mean, it's about sort of, intrinsic, there are all kinds of ways to have intrinsic motivation and to sort of take measure of the benefit of having a positive, healthy experience. And it's important to me that I sort of can be a guide towards someone having a positive intellectual experience so that if you do have a bad one, you have something good to measure it against.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I
You
mean,
know?
that's 100% what it was for me working with you and working with, Professor Strange,
Mhm.
Dr. Brackey just really, really made me think about how, yes, I was applying, I wanted to be a Marshall Scholar, but I think more valuable than that, especially at that time in my life when I was about to leave this place that had been so safe and so wonderful and where I'd really come into my own, was that I
Mhm.
understood what was important to me,
Yeah.
understood how I thought much better than, just some of the things that I had tried to do to kind of figure that out before, right? To
Yes.
actually sit down and write the story that again it wasn't the main character in, but to have these people who I revered so much singing the song that I wanted them to sing really,
Yes.
really brought so much together for me at that time.
Right. I mean, that in this capitalist economy,
Yeah.
that wants you to shop till you drop, that a part of what you discovered is that one of the greatest things you can have in life is clarity.
Yeah.
And so that can be so rewarding. As I think I mentioned that to you before, that's always my New Year's resolution, that that's
Mhm.
that's what I want, right? And the thing that young Black people, they still give me hope though, even when I get frustrated with these children. I am always hopeful because they make it clear to me that they still value clarity, and
Mhm.
they also seem to value it when they think you're telling them the truth.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and that's what gives me hope, because that suggests an investment in both courage and integrity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think that we are contributing to that through this, and I'm very happy that we're extending this to so many people. And I look forward to seeing them, what, on the 13th at 1?
Yeah, yeah, in a couple of days. I do too. I'm so excited for this.
Okay. All right. Well, hang on. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'll still talk to you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.